three-day Group of Seven summit and also the NATO summit has drawn to a close, with leaders of the Club of Seven Nations signing a communique. It touched upon several matters like COVID-19 vaccines, climate change, and China. The G7 agreed to donate 1 billion vaccine doses to poorer countries. On climate change, there was a pledge to honor existing commitment to offer 100 billion a year for climate action. What has drawn attention is a new initiative coming out of the meeting, the so-called Build Back Better World Plan, which was touted as a direct counter to China. Leaders also issued a critical communique that delved into China's internal affairs. In response, a spokesperson from the Chinese embassy in the UK cried foul over the critique, saying a small club of nations do not rule the world. On this, let's loop in our panelists.
The 2021 NATO summit was a first in more ways than one. The first time U.S. President Joe Biden attended the meeting of transatlantic allies. And the first time the group dedicated so much attention to China, singled out 10 times in the final communique, in the clearest sign yet of NATO's converging concerns over China's growing influence. The only country talked about more than China was Russia, with relations at the lowest point since the Cold War. It was an opportunity to grab Biden's ear before he heads off for Geneva for talks with President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday.
This was President Biden's first NATO summit, and he showed up with the one thing allied leaders had been longing for: reassurance that the U.S. is fully committed to the alliance. Transatlantic relations back on friendly ground, at least as long as Joe Biden sits in the White House.
For the G7 summit and also the NATO meeting in D.C., we have Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow and Director of Research for Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. He's also of the author, The Art of War in an Age of Peace, U.S. Grand Strategy and Resolute Restraint. In Toronto, John Kirton, Director of the G7 Research Group from the University of Toronto. In Tokyo, Kato Yoshikatsu, who is the Adjunct Associate Professor from the Asia Global Institute with the University of Hong Kong. Last but not least, in Beijing, Wang Yiwei, Jean Monnet Chair, Professor and Director of the Center for EU Studies from Renmin University of China. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. What happened at the NATO summit? How much is rhetorics? How much is likely to be translated into real strategies? Mr. O'Hanlon?
Greetings. Well, I would say two things. First, it is, I think, overall a good meeting in the sense that NATO only works if there is solidarity across all the major allies, including, obviously, the United States. The bad news is that I don't see any new vision for how to reduce tensions with Russia. And I think we need a new big idea. All the talk about bringing Ukraine into NATO is, to my mind, a bad idea and guaranteed to only exacerbate tension and probably not even work, probably not even succeed in bringing the country into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So I don't really see a new vision for Russia policy coming out of Washington or anywhere else in NATO. And that to me is a missed opportunity. So those are my takeaways, both good and bad.
Mr. O'Hanlon, if I could follow up, there was also in the statement talking about the so-called systematic threat coming from China, and there has also been accusations of China building a space exploration and also some of the nuclear warheads. Yet we all know the number of nuclear warheads in China is much smaller than NATO's, not to mention than the United States. How do you see this? Is this going to have rhetoric changing the color of the reality, or are we going to see using China as a rallying force among the NATO members?
That's a good question. I agree with your skepticism. I don't quite understand why NATO would make the nuclear weapons issue a focal point. There are a lot of reasons why NATO needs to be at some level competitive with China and a little bit concerned about China's behavior on certain investments. but I don't see the nuclear weapons issue as being in the top tier. You're right, the United States and France and Britain together have far more warheads than China. And of all the things that I might criticize China for, being engaged in a nuclear weapons competition is not at the top of my list. I believe that China has shown relative restraint. We do need to be vigilant about China's investment in high-tech sectors, some of the rules of the road for economic engagement. I think on those matters, NATO can engage. But on the nuclear weapons issue, I was a little bit surprised myself.
Mr. Kirton and Mr. Kato, how do you see the outcome with the apparent rhetorics?
Well, I thought it was a good NATO summit for different reasons. The first was President Biden's very firm statement, definitive, clear, that he believed not only in NATO, but in Article 5, and that's exactly the kind of reassurance that our frontline friends in the Baltics, in Poland need, and that Mr. Putin needs to hear. The second, in reference to Ukraine, I think what Mr. Biden was most eloquent on, and yes, is somewhat folksy way, is that Ukraine has to meet all of the conditions for membership, no corruption, rule of law, and a lot more, and that it wasn't up to the United States to decide alone. It was all of the allies, and there's a diversity of views on that. So there's no fast track there. And the final thing, NATO finally has put the natural environment back on the agenda after about half a century, the focus on climate change. And that is one area where we know, and Mr. Biden and others said it at the G7 summit, that we have to cooperate with Russia because our big superpower are right next door up in Alaska, north of Canada too.
All right. Mr. Kato?
Japan is not a member of NATO, but Japan's relation with NATO. In this sense, I think our Prime Minister attended G7 and he won the full support from G7 leaders on holding Olympics. This is maybe the biggest diplomatic achievement for Suga. And in terms of vaccination, because Japan is obviously very backward.
Professor Wang, you have heard members of the G7 and also NATO's our guests coming from those countries talking. To you, what is interesting coming out of the two meetings?
This is a very crucial summit for NATO. Since the end of the Cold War, there's a legitimacy crisis for NATO. They lost the traditional adversary, Soviet Union, and also the military bloc. And then the September 11th saved NATO for an untraditional threat. Now NATO withdrew the troops from Afghanistan, so they need so-called the adversary to keep the existence. The U.S. relations with NATO we can describe as that what the U.S. wants to do, NATO not necessarily follow. But if the United States do not want NATO to do, definitely NATO cannot do. So that means the U.S. now have so-called China phobia. They want to sell this to all the other members of the G7 and NATO, but not necessarily there can be a positive response. For instance, in the President Macron says the G7 NATO cannot be the anti-China group. Yes, because 30 member states of NATO, the European Union is more than 23. So if according to the principles of democracy, voting unilaterally, unanimously, and then I don't think you can put China as a threat or enemy, adversary stance. However, U.S. still contribute more than 70% of the budget, and then also the minds, the wisdoms of the even the muscles of the NATO, depends on the U.S. However, most of the NATO members agree that China is challenged by not as a adversary or enemy. And most of them still think about Russia as a traditional threat to NATO. We're very worried about that NATO will put more and more on China to replace or parallel us with Russia as the common threat.
On the other hand, Professor Wang, I have to follow up because the statement coming from the spokesperson from China's EU mission suggests that China will not forget the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia. And also, if NATO's policy toward China will go toward systematic challenge as described in the statement. China will not sit still. How would you understand these words? And Professor, do you see there is likely to be a downslope, dramatic downslope, as a result of the apparent consensus between the United States and its NATO partners?
Well, there are two obstacles between China and NATO due to some cooperation. First of all, you mentioned about the history. The bombing of our embassy in Belgrade, of course, the Chinese people remember very clearly. But I think the Chinese people understand that is the US bombing in the name of NATO. It's like Korean War. It's a China-US confrontation, but in the name of the United Nations, 1950s. So that's very clear. Secondly, is China-Russian relations. China very concerned about Russia's response. So any engagement with NATO is very limited and consult with Russia. But now, because so many challenges we face in company, so we need to go beyond that two obstacles. And most importantly, I think the China-US should build some consensus to not to repeat the tragedy of Cold War.
All right. Now, Mr. O'Hanlon, many understand that there needs to be a rallying force inside the United States for the U.S. to overcome many of its domestic challenges and its international challenges as a result of absence of diplomacy over the past 5 years. But will picking up China and picking up Russia continuously be the way out? Many have that question, particularly in terms of its sustainability, Mr. O'Hanlon.
It's a great question. I would remind you that some of the roots of our tougher policy towards China and Russia go back to the Obama administration. It was really around the year 2014 when, from an American perspective, we can debate whether the United States was right, but from an American perspective, it was around that time when relations started to deteriorate. Obviously, 2014 was a crucial year with Russia because of the annexation of Crimea and the ongoing aggression in the Donbass, the shoot down of the Malaysian jetliner. All of that goes back to 2014. With China, it's more gradual, but the point is it's not just Trump. It wasn't just Trump. It was even the previous administration where Biden was vice president. So I think some of the same themes will continue. And the Biden administration is trying to be clear that it will try to sustain some of the toughness towards both Moscow and Beijing, but in a more workmanlike, predictable way. And what does that mean? Well, it's going to depend on the issue. It's going to depend on the policy, and it's going to be hard. I'm not completely happy with how they're doing. You heard me already criticize that we don't really seem to have a Russia policy. Doesn't really seem to all add up to me. How to handle Ukraine, for example.
Very interesting.
On China,
yeah, please.
Yeah.
Sorry,
on China, we have this issue of compete, cooperate, and only confront when necessary. You know, that's a reasonable framework, but how do you apply it issue by issue? So this is the kind of thing we have to debate in detail and get the individual policies right.
Do you have the fear, as some experts do, with the upcoming midterm election in the United States, that the political wind might swish everything into the extreme end? And we also see even President Biden breaking out of tradition, talking about the Republican Party on the sidelines of the NATO Summit from the earlier tradition of U.S. President not to talk about internal issues, internal politics during that occasion. By the way, also, you talk about China's behavior in your answer about who to blame, quote unquote. That seems to be a question often asked these days. But if you look at the internal problems inside the United States, racial issues, wealth gap, and the list goes on, it goes back much earlier than 2014, one could argue. Right. So, Mr. O'Hanlon, on these complicated issues, please.
Yeah, well, first of all, you're right. And I think that if China and the United States can each be friendly critics of each other, we can perhaps make this a good competition. Because I think the United States needs to get a lot better on race relations. needs to get a lot better on internal cohesion, needs to get better on how we handle our poor and middle class workers. And so when Chinese friends criticize us for not doing enough, you're right. I don't disagree. And if the dialogue can be constructive in both directions, there's no harm in that. On the issue of the midterm elections, I think that the Republicans probably will do pretty well. But the interesting thing is that may actually help Biden or Vice President Harris in 2024. Because to me, for foreign policy, the big question is who will win the next presidential election in the United States? And for me, it's crucial that Donald Trump not win.
Right.
And therefore, if you look at the dynamics of our history, often if the opposition party does well in the midterm, like for example, the Republicans did well in 1994, then Bill Clinton won re-election very easily in 1996 because he could conjure up the fear in voters that they would otherwise give the whole power structure in Washington to the Republicans. And so, to be honest with you, Joe Biden may actually benefit if the Republicans have a good midterm election.
Well, of course, we also heard about the legends of the so-called lame duck president, as President Obama was suffering from during his second term. But anyway, that's the internal politics. Even though as rich as it is, I want to move on to Mr. Kato. As you have already noticed, there are a lot of nuances about the United States and where it is going, and there's certainly going to have an impact on the relationship between the United States and others as well, including from China and also including from its NATO partners, G7 partners. So how do you see these nuances from your where you are?
Sure. As other guest said, I think now the rise of China is a reality, and Japan is seeing the strategic rivalry or competition between the U.S. and China is reality, but it should be manageable. In this sense, Japan, why from Japanese perspective, why I would say, we are welcome to see G7 is back based on shared value, because in the U.S. and Japan, our alliance should invest on multilateralism very much. And this is the only way for Japan to deal with China, because thanks to our peaceful pacifist constitution or our history, so it's the only way for Japan to manage the relation with China, in the framework of U.S.-Japan alliance. And in this sense, the multilateralism should be the most legitimized framework. So in this sense, I would say, from G7 summit to NATO, I think it is a good thing to talk and deal with China unambiguously.
There is worry and concerns, Mr. Kato, that Japan might want to cash in on the apparent concerns about China and the U.S. trying to establish China as a competitor / a rivalry in order to rally its domestic politics. Mr. Kato, do you see it is smart for Japan to do so or not as China's closest neighbor?
Yes, China has been the biggest trading partner for Japan. So even for Abe and Suga, the maintaining the economic ties with China is always the crucial issue for their legitimacy. But looking at the U.S.-China strategic rivalry, that is multidimensional. Sometimes cooperative, sometimes competitive, sometimes strategic, sometimes geopolitical. This is going to be more multidimensional. So the things are changing very complicatedly. So for Japan, we cannot deal with China independently. This is not good or bad, but this is the reality since the end of World War II. We have to depend on U.S.-Japan alliance, but we shouldn't exclude the right of China. We need to learn how to work with China. In this sense, we hope U.S.-China strategic rivalry should be manageable, and Japan should do something on that.
I see. What is your expectation for the meeting between the U.S. president and the Russian president likely to take place on Wednesday, Mr. Hanlon?
I don't think there will be any big developments or big mistakes, because I think that President Biden has already been criticized enough, even for having the meeting, that he's being very careful not to let himself somehow be duped by Putin. However, I am still a little nervous that we go into this with no clear sense of what we want U.S.-Russia or NATO-Russia policy to be. There's not really the sense of a big new review or vision or concept. You know, we lifted some sanctions on the companies involved in Nord Stream 2 without really explaining why. Biden and Putin get into this sort of slightly silly exchange about who's a bigger killer. You know, it feels like there hasn't really been enough preparation. And so I hope I'll be disabused of that concern. And at least I don't really worry about a major debacle, but I'm not expecting anything momentous, and I'm a little bit nervous.
Professor Wang?
The strategic autonomy for the Europeans, a long way to go, particularly in the military and some new technology. When you don't have your own search engine, too much rely on external force. That's a tragedy.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Michael O'Halloran, John Kirton, Kato Yoshikatsu,